Thank you for attending 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium Session 261, titled, I'll Never Not Be Mormon, The Impact of Disaffiliation on Identity and Womanhood. The audio for this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Huba app for the remainder of 2020. There will be a Q&A at the end of this session for the last 10 to 15 minutes, so if you have any questions, please type them into your Huba app to be addressed during the Q&A. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, there is more than one way to Mormon. We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. When women leave the LDS Church, many are left navigating changes regarding what womanhood means to them and how it impacts their daily choices. This presentation summarizes the results of Emily Janes's thesis on how the process of disaffiliation from the church impacts women's views of their woman. Interviews with 25 women who have disaffiliated from the church provide insight into the socialization of women in the church, the pain and grief they feel as they deconstruct their beliefs through the process of disaffiliation, and the peace many feel from unbinding their views on womanhood. I'll take a second to introduce our speaker before we begin. Emily Janes is a recent graduate of the Marriage and Family Therapy Master's Program at Virginia Tech University and is set to begin a doctoral program in marriage and family therapy at Texas Tech University at the end of August. When she isn't studying or seeing clients, she enjoys spending time with her husband, Matt, reading and watching the Washington Nationals. I'll now give the floor to our presenter.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, for introducing me in today's session. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and we will jump into it. So, okay. So as you know, the title of this presentation is I'll Never Not Be Mormon, the Impact of Disaffiliation on Identity and Womanhood. And so as announced, I'm Emily Janes. My email is on the first slide of the presentation.
Emily?
Yeah.
Your audio is cutting out. Just so
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Okay. Let me mute myself really quick and see if that is helpful. Okay, is that any better, Glenn?
It sounds good right now.
Okay, fabulous. Let's go ahead and reshare that. One second. Okay. So my email is on that first slide. So if anyone is interested in getting more information about the study or collaborating on future research projects, please feel free to reach out either to that email or in the Huva app, and I would love to hear from you. And so, one second, a little bit of trouble. There we go. So just to give you kind of a brief overview of our agenda and where we'll be going today, I'll start out by introducing myself a tiny bit, giving some context on our relationship with church. And then
Emily, it's having the same problem.
Okay.
Maybe switching to phone audio.
Yep, sure. I will do that really quick. I will turn off my camera and go ahead and do that. Hey, Glenn, do you happen to have the phone number that I can call, or is it sounding any better right now?
It sounds fine right now.
Okay, I switched to the system, so hopefully that will work.
Okay.
But I can switch to phone if I need to in a minute.
It's fine, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. And so just kind of, again, just a brief overview of the agenda. Then I'll introduce just some background information and the research question, as well as my theoretical lens for the project. And then very briefly, I'll go over the methods of the project and then really focus in on the findings. So the different themes and subthemes that I found from the data, as well as giving you some quotes from participants so that you can hear their voices and kind of their experiences. And then we'll talk a little bit in the discussion section about why this project was important, what we learned from it, what the findings mean, and why they're important, as well as some limitations to the study and future directions that I gained from the data. And so as announced, there will be a question and answer period at the end. So please send in those questions in the Whova app, and I would be happy to go through all of them when we're done. And so thinking about just introducing myself and kind of my context. So as you know, my name is Emily Janes, and I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. in Rockville, Maryland. I did my undergraduate work at Utah State University, and I just barely in May graduated with my master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Virginia Tech. And in just a couple of weeks, I'll be starting my doctoral program, again studying marriage and family therapy at Texas Tech University. And so most of my research interests revolve around kind of the intersection of identity and religion or spirituality, more specifically looking at the impact of disaffiliation from a religious structure on individual, couple, and family identity. I'm also interested in looking at how can we make mental health services specifically for children and families more accessible in rural populations and more effective for people living in rural places. So now just a little bit of information about me and my relationship with the church. I was raised in the LDS church in a fairly active family, and it was a really important part. Our membership in the church was a really important part of our family identity as well as my individual identity, especially since oftentimes we were the only members that people knew. And so that was a really important part about how we identified ourselves in our community. As I got older, lots of people in my immediate family, extended family, and just kind of in my circle of influence, a lot of people chose to step away from the church. And so I got kind of this front row seat to disaffiliation in that process and how it impacted people. And especially with the women in my life who had chosen to step away from the church, I noticed them asking a lot of questions about their identity, what the church means to them, and how the church influenced their identities pretty intimately. And so that experience of watching people kind of led me to this project and thinking about some of these questions. In terms of my own relationship with the church, it's complicated at the moment. There are parts of the church that I love and that resonate with me, and there are a lot of parts about the church and the teachings in the church that I really struggle with. And so at the moment, I'm kind of in this limbo place where I'm fairly active in the church, but have extremely nuanced and progressive beliefs. And I'm just kind of taking it day by day to see what decision I want to make ultimately about my relationship with the church and what that will look like. And so I think that that's important for you as the audience to know, as I was the head researcher on this project, just to kind of have an understanding of where I am with the church and what lens I was using as I analyzed the data. So I do just want to give you a little bit of background information about kind of the literature and what's been done and what led me to this study. So just some general information about religious disaffiliation. Religious nuns is the fastest growing religious group in the United States currently. And that umbrella term of religious nuns is composed of two different groups of people. So people who were raised without a religious identity, who have been religious nuns for all of their lives, and people who have left their religion of origin. And that's the much larger group that kind of composes this umbrella of religious nuns, are people who grew up in a religious structure, but after a gradual shift in their beliefs, have chosen to step away. And so looking at the LDS church in particular, the church is reporting lower retention rates than ever before. And so thinking about emerging adults, which are individuals ages about 18 to 24, in 2007, the church reported about 70% retention, but by the time, just a few years later in 2014, when that survey went back out, they were reporting about 64% retention. Additionally, through different studies, we know that about 50 to 75% of people who convert to the church deactivate within a year of their baptism. So there are lots of different consequences of religious disaffiliation, and because it's such an individual process, the consequences that people experience will be different for everyone. But lots of studies have reported both positive and negative consequences, which include, for the positive consequences, increased feelings of freedom, less anxiety, and feelings of integrity for making a choice that was congruent with their belief system. And then the negative consequences that are often cited are loss of community and social support, family disintegration, feelings of guilt and shame, confusion and doubt around the choice that they made to disaffiliate, loss of a moral code, loss of confidence in themselves, and feelings of resentment towards religious institutions and deity. Now, a really important finding that has come up in quite a few studies is that the process of disaffiliation oftentimes leads to intense feelings of self-reflection and loss of identity. However, although that has come up in several different studies, there's kind of this gap in the literature, a massive gap in the literature about, we know that it happens, but we don't really know what that means or how people experience it or what that really looks like. And so I was hoping with my study to kind of step into this gap in the literature and hopefully help to fill it in some ways. And so with my study, I really wanted to look at that sense of identity loss and what does that look like, and how do, in particular, LDS women experience that loss of identity and that shift in their identity. And so before we go into any more background information, I do want to introduce my research question just to give you some context about why I think it's important that you have the background information that I'll give you. So my research question was, how, if at all, did leaving the LDS church change how you view yourself as a woman and your overall view of womanhood? And so again, I really wanted to look at kind of thinking about identity. It's complex, but this one piece of your identity, kind of your gender identity, how does that shift and how does that change? And I thought that this was important in particular because there are a lot of teachings on womanhood within the LDS church. And so we know from the proclamation to the world on the family that gender is an eternal principle, that is something that's believed in the church, meaning that gender is consistent in the premortal world, in the mortal world, and in the afterlife. And as such, gender dictates roles that individuals are to fulfill in their mortal life. Now, Mormon feminist scholars have talked about how common societal conceptions from the 1830s, so when the church was founded, continue to be taught and handed down from generation to generation of Mormon women, meaning that motherhood and being a wife are framed in the church as women's greatest joy and accomplishment. Now, it is important to note that today it is more acceptable for women to pursue an education and to be involved in their communities. However, as recently as 2018, general authorities made it clear at General Conference that motherhood and being a wife should come before all worldly pursuits for women in their lives. And so I do want to give just a tiny bit of information about identity construction as well as gender identity development. And this is in no way supposed to be an exhaustive summary. There are so many theories on identity construction and gender identity development, but these are just some of the things that I pulled that really helped me to kind of formulate the questions that I would ask and for my study. And so just a little bit about identity construction. Identity is complex and it's composed of many different factors, including but not limited to sociocultural factors and heritage culture. Sociocultural factors would be things like behavioral norms and belief systems, and heritage culture would be a culture that's assigned to someone at birth, or a culture that has had a significant impact on someone's family or on their ancestors. So if you start to think about the LDS church, it makes a lot of sense given these definitions of kind of components of identity that Mormonism and that Mormon identity could be a very important part of someone's identity, in that it provides behavioral norms and a belief structure for people, as well as for people born into the church. It's a culture assigned at their birth, and it may have had an extremely important impact or large impact on their families or on their ancestors. It's also important to note that in identity construction, gender is generally viewed as part of one's core identity, which means that it informs all aspects of their identity and all of the interactions that they have in the world. So thinking a little bit deeper about gender identity development, we know that it begins at birth, that from the moment we're born, we're socialized about what our culture and our community and society expects about different genders and different gender identities. And so puberty is a particularly important part of gender identity development. It's a really important stage, in that at this point, gender roles and expression become more rigid and one's self-concept of gender begins to solidify. There is one theory of gender identity development that talks about this age period of about 10 to 13 as being a real crossroads for gender development. And that based on societal stereotypes and cultural messages that someone is receiving about their gender, they will either go this direction where they have a very traditional essentialist view of their gender, or they might go this direction where they have a more open, flexible view of gender and gender expression and gender identity. And so that developmental period of about 10 to 13 is really important for gender development. And so bringing it back to LDS women, why is this important? Well, we know based on church teachings that most Mormon women are raised with traditional and essentialist notions of womanhood. And I think it's particularly important to point out that this crossroads period, again, kind of 10 to 13, that directly aligns with when young women's classes start at the age of like 11 or 12. And so during this crossroads period, our young ones, our kind of tween teen people in the church are getting these very gendered topics and discussions about modesty, marriage, motherhood, chastity, all of these things that might influence kind of what direction they go at that crossroads. Now, it's also important to note, and this is important for the study, that views on gender can change throughout the lifespan, and that as one's identity changes, so will their self-concept of gender. And so as we add roles to our identity or we renegotiate roles that have existed in the past, all of those things will inform how we view our gender, and then vice versa, how we view our gender will then impact how we view our identities. So that leads me into talking just a tiny bit about hybrid identity theory, which is the theoretical lens that I used for this project. And again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive review or summary of hybrid identity theory. This is just kind of some important information that I think will help you understand kind of where I was coming from with gender or with data analysis and kind of the results that I came up with. And so hybrid identity theory, I have a quote, and this is from a researcher with the last name of Lowe, who wrote about hybrid identity theory. And they said that it is used to examine, quote, the encounter, conflict, and or blending of two ethnic or cultural categories, which while by no means pure and distinct in nature, tend to be understood and experienced as meaningful identity labels by members of those categories. So oftentimes we'll see hybrid identity theory used in the literature to help examine the experiences of immigrant families or transnational families, but it can be used to look at gender, and more specifically the negotiation of differing meanings and expectations of gender encountered in different roles and different settings. And so we have heard and read from feminist Mormon scholars that oftentimes it can feel oxymoronic to be a Mormon feminist or to have any kind of non-traditional view of womanhood within the church. So hybrid identity theory would posit that the creation of a hybrid identity is viewed as a way of achieving stability and security. So kind of resolving some of that tension within the identity when you have things or identifiers that kind of brush up against each other. And so going into this project, I was viewing kind of the ex-Mormon or post-Mormon identity as a hybrid identity in and of itself that combines the worldviews of the ex or post identity, kind of that role, the Mormon role, and then the female role, that was a hybrid identity combining those three roles. And so it's important to note that in hybrid identity, the creation of a hybrid identity symbolizes the shift from one culture to another. So from this culture and its ideals and beliefs to a more self-constructed culture of what you want it to look like. Now, it's really important to know, and I'll make this a tiny bit more clear, I have a visual on the next couple of slides, that the cultural teachings and forces from all of the cultures within the identity hierarchy are still at play. And so just because I've stepped away from the church, it doesn't mean that that culture or that identity of mine just disappears, right? It's still at play. And that's really important because the tension between cultures creates space for an individual to define their own self-concept of womanhood or whatever kind of identity you're looking at. That tension allows there to be space for you to kind of lean in and identify for yourself how you want to identify that part of your identity. So I have a little visual just to make it a little bit more clear. And I just want to point out that there are so many ways, there are so many different identities and so many ways that this could play out, but this was a pretty common example for the participants that I worked with. And so there's lots of different ways, and I'll repeat that as I go through the visuals, but this is just one example of what this might look like. And so as you can see on the slide, there's kind of this pyramid, this hierarchy of identifiers. And so there's the identity of woman, mother, wife, and Mormon. And at least in this identity hierarchy, the Mormon piece is at the top. It has a lot of importance and a lot of significance for this person. So say that this person is walking through life and somehow in a class or through a friend, they're exposed to feminist teachings and they read some things and they say, hey, I really like this. This super resonates with me. I think I would like to adopt the identity of feminist into my identity hierarchy. So they're adding feminist as a part of their identity. But then they quickly start to realize that the ideals and beliefs and teachings of feminism start to brush up against some of the beliefs and ideals of Mormonism. And so there's tension, they don't really fit. And so how can I create some more stability or security within my own identity? And hybrid identity theory would say to take pieces of Mormonism and to take pieces of feminism, whatever that looks like for you, and to combine them into a hybrid identity. And so for participants in my study, for many of them, this looked like creating the identity of a post-Mormon woman, where they had all of the ideals that they wanted from both, and then they created this new identity for themselves. And so post-disaffiliation, their identity hierarchy might look a little bit something like this. And so you'll notice that the 4 identifiers from the first pyramid are still there. The Mormon piece, the woman piece, the mother piece, and the wife piece are all still there. But you'll notice that the Mormon piece has less salience. It's at the bottom. And the post-Mormon piece has a little bit more salience in the identity hierarchy now. And so again, they don't just disappear. Those identities still continue to impact and inform all other pieces of the identity structure, and it's just kind of the process of renegotiation and figuring out how that fits in. And so that's kind of what we'll be talking about with the results and kind of how that played out for my participants. So before we jump into the findings, I do just want to briefly go over the methodology. And if you want more information about the methodology and kind of the research part, please feel free to reach out. But I know that that's not everyone's cup of tea. So I'm just going to go over it kind of quickly. But I did use interpretive phenomenology to analyze the data. And interpretive phenomenology helps us to understand in detail how meaning is processed and attributed to experiences. Interpretive phenomenology is particularly helpful in examining complex social processes such as disaffiliation from a religious structure. And something that was really important to me and that I really liked about interpretive phenomenology is that it allows the researcher to take cultural context into account, which for me felt very important, kind of looking at Mormonism as a cultural identity and trying to give that space in the data analysis. And so this was a really important part of the analysis process for me, that I found a way of doing that that let me look at the culture and let me take that cultural context into account. And so I had 25 participants. I interviewed 25 women, and all of them were recruited from social media groups as well as snowball sampling. And the inclusion criteria for participation was that they needed to identify as a woman, that they left the church voluntarily as opposed to having been excommunicated, that they were born and raised in the church, and lastly, that they left the church at least 1 year prior to the study beginning. So now we're going to jump into the findings, and with these findings, we're going to go through several themes and subthemes, and then I'll give quotes that support each theme and subtheme, again, so that you can hear the voices of the participants. So as you can see on this slide, there are several themes and subthemes that I found from the data. You can imagine interviewing 25 people for about an hour to an hour and a half. There's a lot of experiences and a lot of things are discussed. And so these are some of the themes, or all of the themes and subthemes that I pulled from this data for this project. And so we'll start, and the themes, I've kind of organized them to almost take you kind of on a journey or kind of share the story of participants, where we start kind of where they were, where they felt limited by church teachings and felt shame and dissonance around what they were taught in the church and how their identities were. And then there's two themes where we'll talk a little bit about kind of the impact on identity overall. And the last one is kind of about the expansion or post-disaffiliation, how they felt about womanhood and how things had changed for them in regards to womanhood. And so we'll start out with this first theme, which is that many participants felt limited by church teachings. And then there's 2 subthemes underneath there, which the first would be, I never thought of my own future. And the second is, I didn't live up to my potential. So kind of that overarching theme, limited by church teachings, when I asked participants what they learned about womanhood or what it meant within the church to be a righteous woman, every single participant talked about the importance of marriage and the importance of becoming a mother, but not only becoming a mother, but being a stay-at-home mother. Many participants discussed how they felt that they were given primary goals and secondary goals in the church. That the primary goals were this idea of righteous womanhood. So getting married, becoming a mother, being a stay-at-home mother, and then their secondary goals were more so the things that they wanted to do for themselves. So thinking about hobbies, a career, gaining an education, but that within the church, it was made very clear to them that your primary goals have to come first. They have to come before those secondary goals, and those secondary goals should be dropped if the primary goals happen first. Many participants also talked about the concept of benevolent misogyny and feeling that within the church, there was kind of this attitude of pedestalizing women and kind of putting them above men in terms of kind of value or virtue or spirituality, areas like that. And many participants described how at some point in their life, it felt kind of empowering to hear those messages. But when they stepped into spaces where they wanted to use their voice, share their ideas, be a leader within their church, they were pushed off that pedestal, so to speak, over and over and over again, which left them feeling very confused and feeling as if, do they really believe this, or is there a belief system underneath the surface that I'm just not aware of about my role as a woman in the church? And lastly, I think it's important to note some of the emotions that came out while we were talking about these things. And for many of the participants, they described feelings of anger and frustration about what they were taught in the church and kind of the direct consequences of those teachings in their lives. So this is the first quote that I'll share with you. And just as an aside, these are not the real names of the participants. Each participant was given a pseudonym. And so these are just pseudonyms for each participant. But Mary said, "If I get married, that seals my social status. A woman who isn't married is like nothing. That's the worst thing you could ever be. So I really, really tried to get married quickly and young because of that, because I didn't want to be that single woman. I felt I would be lost if I didn't follow this set path for me." Similarly, Sarah said, "I was raised to be a stay-at-home mom, and I literally never even considered that maybe that wouldn't be the best for me, because that's the best because I'm a woman." So moving on to that first sub-theme underneath feeling limited by church teachings, the first sub-theme is I never thought of my own future. And so again, thinking about those teachings of the importance of being a mother, being a wife, and being a stay-at-home mom, many of the participants felt that the way that those teachings were packaged and delivered to them as young women, and even beyond that, it was almost as if the church was handing them a blueprint or a map, a plan, a mold for their lives, and for what the church wanted them to become. And because many of these participants described this feeling of, I really believed the church, I believed that it was true, and so I believed that this package or blueprint they were giving me was really what God wanted for me, it kind of left them feeling like there's no need to think for myself. There's no need to think beyond this blueprint because this is what I need to be doing. And so many participants discussed at length how they never really thought about their own future. Now, there were a handful of participants that had thought or had kind of fleeting thoughts of, oh, I wish that I could do that, or that's something that I'm really interested in. And so they described really intense feelings of feeling trapped or stuck because of this blueprint and because of what they believed God expected of them. So Martha, of this experience in her adolescence, said, I just couldn't create a picture of my future, mostly because I didn't want what I thought I had to accept. And now moving into that last sub-theme of I didn't live up to my potential, many participants expressed deep remorse, sorrow, grief, and mourning for the opportunities that they felt they denied themselves because of church teachings and because of this blueprint that they were given. And so many participants could remember several examples of making choices contrary to what they wanted as an individual based on church doctrine and church teachings. And so this came up in a lot of different ways. There were women who didn't move to a certain place because it didn't fit the blueprint, denied themselves travel experiences, career opportunities, scholarships, going to a specific school for college, all sorts of different things that they felt that they denied themselves because they wanted to follow this blueprint and they wanted to do the things that they were instructed to do at church. Some women even talked about how they attempted to change their personalities, that they saw kind of this mold of a Mormon woman and that they felt they were too talkative, too bold, too assertive. And so they really tried to, one of the participants said, tone it down or turn it down. They tried to turn down parts of their personalities so that they would better fit this mold and better follow the blueprint that they were given for their lives. And so Esther said, I grieve. I'm grieving for that little girl because I didn't really take a hard look at myself to really find what I was passionate about and what I dreamed to do. Because in the end, I knew what I was going to do already. I knew my job already. I was going to be a mom. So why try hard in school, you know? Why really try and figure out what makes me feel alive? Because I already know what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a mom. It's fine that I don't get a scholarship to a really good school. It's fine that I'm going to go to college, but I'm going to go to college to find a husband because in the end, I'm going to be a mom. So I very much feel like I cheated myself on some really prime opportunities growing up. So now we're going to move into the second major theme, which was feelings of shame and cognitive dissonance. And these feelings of shame came up for participants in a lot of different ways. And so these are just some examples, but some participants felt shame for not fitting the mold or following the blueprint or for questioning the mold of what it means to be a Mormon woman. Some participants felt shame for not having the desire to fit the mold, for just not wanting to do the things that they were told to do. Many women felt shame around accomplishments that they experienced outside of the mold. So that was mostly academic accomplishments and career accomplishments. And then lastly, many participants felt a lot of shame for fitting the mold. So for doing the things that the church instructed them to do, for following that blueprint to a T, but not finding it fulfilling and not finding joy and accomplishment in what they were doing. Again, kind of thinking about the emotions and the experience of discussing this, many of the participants referred to themselves as failures for times that they didn't fit the mold or that they didn't follow the blueprint, and really expressed deep feelings of failure for what they had done or what they had not done. And so Emmeline talked about kind of that shame that came from accomplishments outside of the blueprint. So she said, I'm trying to make myself understand that my contributions to the world are valid. There's that classic Mormon quote that no success can compensate for failure in the home. And that quote haunted me for years and years because I, for so many Mormon years, was a failure in the home. I hadn't gotten married at 21 or at 19, and I had pursued my own career instead. So I was a failure in the home. That quote still, I think, haunts me because I devalue the things I have accomplished. Like I just got my PhD. I'm doing important and interesting things in the world, but I automatically devalue those contributions because I am a failure in the home. And so Velma talks about a different kind of shame. She talks more about the shame that she felt for having done the things on the blueprint, for fitting that mold, but not finding it fulfilling. And so she says of her experience, honestly, the first 2 years of my daughter's life, my oldest daughter, I was a stay-at-home mom and I struggled. I wasn't unhappy, but I didn't feel fulfilled. And I struggled with that because you're supposed to be so happy and fulfilled being a mother. So now we're moving on to the next theme, which is a direct quote from the participant, or from one of the participants who said, I didn't feel good at all about being a woman. And there are 3 sub-themes underneath this one that I'll list off now, but they do kind of stack up on each other, and I'll explain a little bit about how that is when we go over each sub-theme. So the 3 sub-themes underneath this theme are, quote, a caretaker of men. So again, another quote from a participant. Another quote from a participant here, second guessing myself is the second sub-theme, and then the third sub-theme is no boundaries. So thinking about this kind of overarching theme, I didn't feel good at all about being a woman. Many of the participants described about how the more they learned about church doctrine and the more they learned about kind of views on womanhood in the church, that they started to feel very much less than men. Many participants used the phrase that I felt like a second-class citizen to men in the church. Many participants reflected on how they felt they had no power or authority in the church or in the church structure, including within their own callings. And many participants, especially when talking about their experiences in the temple and going through the temple for the first time, many participants talked about how they felt loved and valued less by God based on teachings there. Many participants talked about how it almost made them feel unworthy, and that as women, they could not approach God, they could not have a relationship with God, and that they could not converse with God because they were valued less by him. And so of this, Martha said, because of the way in which women were treated in the church, the way in which I had been treated in the church, and the way in which I've been told not to talk about it effectively, made me feel like I wasn't really worth that much, like we weren't anybody's priority. Men were the priority. The boys are the priority. I also really believed in the church, and so I felt like God must just not care about women that much. And I guess that's something I have to accept, which was a really terrible thing to have to kind of force myself to accept. And so I didn't really feel very good about being a woman, like at all. Like I didn't feel good at all about being a woman. This was a decidedly lesser thing. I almost felt like it made me unworthy. So moving into that first sub-theme, again, this is a direct quote from a participant who said that she felt that in the church, it was her job and responsibility to be a caretaker of men, not only in the church, but more specifically in her family, that she was there to take care of the men in her family. So many participants talked about how this comes out as being supportive roles, that they felt that they were there really to support the men, again, in their families and in the church congregation. And to be there just to support them, and that their jobs were all about supporting the men. Additionally, many participants felt that either indirectly or directly within the church and their families, they were taught that women's needs are not as important as the needs of men. And so again, kind of going back to that quote from Martha from the last slide, they felt that men are the priority, which means that their needs are the priority, and my needs don't really matter that much as a woman. And so Sarah said, the proclamation to the family, it's kind of shoved down your throat. And you know, a woman's role is to nurture children and a man's role is to provide. And I remember even recently as an adult, people making the analogy of somewhere in the Bible, the prophet had to hold up something. And then his arms got tired and people came and helped him hold it. And people saying, that's the woman's role. It's to hold up the priesthood. So now thinking about this second sub-theme, which is another quote from a participant, that's going to happen a lot. Most of these next themes and sub-themes are direct quotes from participants. But this next one is second guessing myself. And so if you think about, here I am, I feel less than men in my church organization. I feel like a second-class citizen, and my main role is to be there to support the men, to go to them, to support them, to ask them for help, and to ask questions of them. This leads to these feelings of second-guessing myself. So many participants talked about how the structure of the church and church teachings around womanhood resulted in a loss of value, a lack of self-esteem, a lack of trust in themselves, in their intuition, in their desires, their thoughts, and their feelings. And this came up again in a lot of different ways, but the two ways that came up the most were during faith transition. So thinking about when you were taught a doctrine and it didn't really land right, or you were confused or didn't really like the way that it sounded, their first inclination was to doubt themselves, as opposed to doubting what the person had told them or how they had learned it or what the doctrine was saying. And so it came up quite a bit in faith transition. And then also the other area where it came up a lot was in personal life decisions. And this was kind of surprising to me as the researcher to hear this multiple times from different participants. But there were lots of personal life decisions that they second guessed themselves on. And one of the ones that came up the most commonly was about children, the decision to have more children, how many children to have, that they really felt like they were second guessing themselves and they couldn't trust their own thoughts or feelings about how many children to have. So I've got a couple of different quotes to kind of outline both of those different areas where second guessing myself came up. So for both of these, for this quote from Marnay, as well as this quote from Esther, both of them were referring to their first experience in the temple and some of the teachings that they learned and heard that just didn't land quite right. And for context, both of them received their endowment before the temple changes that happened a couple of years ago. And so Marnay said, when I went and I didn't have a super duper spiritual experience, I thought something was wrong with me. And Esther said of some of the things discussed in the temple, obviously I'm looking at it wrong. It's just me. Now, Belle was talking more about kind of family planning and her own personal decisions regarding children. And what she said is that really what you want? Do you want one more, or is that just how you were raised? So now moving into that final sub-theme underneath the umbrella of I didn't feel good at all about being a woman. Again, this is something that we discussed previously, but many of the participants felt that they were taught, again, indirectly or directly in the church and in their families, that their needs were not as important as the needs of others around them. And so they felt that they were taught kind of the complete opposite of having boundaries, that they were taught that in fact they were responsible for the emotions, thoughts, and actions of others. This came out a lot within their family units, kind of in that role of being a mom, but also in particular with the thoughts and actions of men. And this started pretty young, kind of preteen age all the way up. And it especially came out, not surprisingly, in areas of sex and consent, that they felt responsible for the thoughts and actions of men around sex. And so Jane said regarding her role as a mother, moms give everything to their families. They don't take anything for themselves. I kind of internalized that that's how I needed to live. I wasn't supposed to do anything for myself, or that was selfish. I wasn't supposed to take care of myself. I had to take care of others first. So now this next theme, this is kind of when we're transitioning from where they started with their beliefs about womanhood from the church. Now we're kind of in that section with the two themes about kind of identity overall and how disaffiliation shifted that. And so this first one is, again, another quote from a participant, a part of myself that died. And so in discussing the choice to disaffiliate and making that conscious decision to disaffiliate from the church, many of the participants talked about how it felt like death, that either a part of them was dying, that they had died and kind of been reborn into a new life. One participant referred to it almost as if she was taking herself off of life support when she stepped away from the church. And so it was a process that felt comparable to death for participants. In talking about kind of this ending or this death from stepping away from the church, this is when many participants started talking about feelings of identity loss and identity crisis. And so not surprisingly, feelings of intense grief and loss were discussed when they were talking about this part of myself that died. And so Velma said, it was the most painful thing that I've ever gone through because, you know, your whole identity is developed in this religion and in this lifestyle. And then to drop everything, it was just painful. Similarly, Jane said, it was heartbreaking to leave. I have an older sister who passed away, and that's like the closest thing to death that I've experienced since her death. I felt like there was a part of myself that died, and I really felt like I was really grieving the loss of who I was and the childlike faith that I held for so long. And so interestingly, while almost every participant described this feeling of death and ending within their identities, they also, almost all of them, talked about this piece of their Mormon identity still remaining, that although they had stepped away from the church and made this conscious effort to disaffiliate, they still felt like that Mormon piece was there. And so this theme is I will never not be Mormon, which you probably recognize from the title of the presentation. And so many of the participants talked about how the Mormon identity continued to maintain significance, both as a cultural identity and a heritage identity. So how they related to their families and their extended family members. And as part of that, and I want you to think back, if you remember kind of those identity hierarchies, those pyramids that I showed early on, because I think that this fits really well. Many of the participants talked about how it was this process of constantly deconstructing the beliefs that they received in the Mormon church and that piece of their identity, kind of deconstructing, taking a closer look at it, and then renegotiating it back into their identity hierarchy. So with who I am today and what I believe about myself and the world today, how does this Mormon piece of my identity continue to make sense and fit in? And so this very constant process of deconstruction and renegotiation and kind of doing that, maybe not day by day, but anytime kind of something came up for them that they needed to deconstruct and really think about how it impacted them. So Esther says, if someone says, are you Mormon? It's still a complicated question to answer because I very much am Mormon. That's my heritage, that's my culture, that's all I know. And so yes, I very much am Mormon. Now we're going to move into the final theme, which is kind of the part of this study where I talk mostly about how people or how participants kind of self-concept of womanhood changed post-disaffiliation. And so again, a direct quote from a participant, this one is, I feel so much peace. And so in talking to the participants and kind of gauging how they feel about womanhood now, almost every participant talked about feeling empowered as a woman post-disaffiliation, that they felt that they had expanded past the blueprint that the church had given them, and that now they had the ability to make choices for themselves, they had the ability to think for themselves, and to do the things that they felt were truly best for them moving forward. A lot of the participants talked about the power that came from not feeling like they had a mold to fill or a mold to fit, that they could throw away that blueprint from the church and really plan for themselves what they thought would be best. Additionally, many participants talked about increased feelings of worthiness and acceptance, both from themselves and from the people that were close to them. They felt like they could be more authentically themselves. And they also talked about an increase of confidence and an increase of self-esteem. And so I have two quotes from participants who talked about this. Eliza said, I felt like leaving the church expanded me. I felt like I had room to breathe. I had freedom. I could finally do the things I always wanted to do. I didn't have to sacrifice myself. None of it was what God wanted and what made me worthy. I could breathe again, and ultimately it led me to actually like myself. It's been the first time in my life that I've been able to say that. And similarly, Emma said, my view of womanhood is finally unbound and liberated and free to become whatever I want to become. And no one is going to tell me what that means again. I no longer feel like I have to fit a mold that was never made for me. I have been fighting that mold my whole life, and now I can breathe. I feel so much peace. And I do just want to note, as the researcher, when you're working on these projects, like there's lots of ideas, and as you analyze the data, lots of things change and new things appear, and it's just, there's a lot of change that goes through or that goes on during these projects. And so back in, several months ago when I initially applied for Sunstone, what I thought my focus would be was this idea of I'll never not be Mormon and kind of the impact of disaffiliation on my participants. And so that was what you saw on kind of the Whova app, and the first slide was the original title, I'll Never Not Be Mormon, the impact of disaffiliation on identity and womanhood. But the more that I dug into the data and the more that I really tried to understand and interpret the data, the more this quote really jumped out to me. And so I just wanted to point out that when I submitted my thesis and finished up my thesis at Virginia Tech, the actual title that I landed on was Womanhood is Finally Unbound. And then the colon and everything else was the same after that. But I really wanted to focus on this really powerful quote that resonated for me, and I think would resonate with a lot of the participants, that post-disaffiliation, womanhood is unbound. There's no longer this blueprint or this mold that they felt that they had to fit. So it was unbound and liberated and free to become what they wanted to become because they had the space to create their own blueprint now. So I just wanted to point out that that's actually the title of the paper now, is Womanhood is Finally Unbound. And so this is just kind of a smaller interview that I did with some of the participants. So that was like the main interview, is where all of that data came from. But as a validity measure, I did what's called member checking interviews. So what that is I went through the data, I analyzed everything and came up with those themes and subthemes that we just went through. And then I delivered those to the participants. And then that gave them an opportunity to ask questions, to make changes, to say like, I don't think you got that quite right. And so I delivered those themes and subthemes to the participants, and it gave them an opportunity to make corrections and check me to make sure that I had analyzed it in a congruent manner with their experiences. And so I did just want to give you some of the information that I got from those member checking interviews. And so the participants that reached back out to me after I sent out the themes and subthemes said that those themes and subthemes resonated, that they felt like it accurately depicted their process and the meaning that they had attributed to that experience. But there were a couple of things, a handful of things that they really wanted to make clear. And I think that as the audience, it's really important for you to hear these things as well. And so the first was that disaffiliation is not a one-size-fits-all process. And so just because these themes and subthemes fit for them and for their experiences, that does not mean that every woman who's disaffiliated from the LDS Church will feel the same way. Disaffiliation is such a personal process and so many moving pieces go into it that it can't be one-size-fits-all. So I think that's important to note that not every woman will feel at peace after they've disaffiliated or feel like their concept of womanhood has changed. And so it's not one size fits all. Another thing that participants really wanted to make clear was that identity renegotiation is ongoing. And so even though that last theme in the paper and in the project is, I feel so much peace, peace and happiness are not endpoints, right? There's a lot of other emotions and different things that, different stages that you might fluctuate in between. And so they wanted to make it clear that it is this ongoing process of identity deconstruction, mourning, and peace. And so that you might fluctuate between grief and gratitude. And so just a little bit of discussion. Why is this important? And so this study supported previous literature that said that disaffiliation and identity reconstruction are intense and painful processes. But what I really want to focus on, and I think is something that really is important that came from the study, is that church teachings around womanhood essentially define Mormon women's identity for them. So if we think back to that blueprint, it's kind of given in a package to women in the church, that their identities generally revolve around these roles of being Mormon, of being a wife, and being a mother. And so when you make the choice to step away from the church, you're not only thinking about what does it mean to me to be a Mormon, you're also now thinking about, okay, well, the teachings of Mormonism affect how I view myself as a woman and how I view myself as a wife and how I view myself as a mother. And so now I need to reconceptualize all of those identities too. And if we remember from the beginning that gender is oftentimes viewed as part of our core identity, which impacts all other parts of our identities, then if we change how I view myself as a woman, now I have to reconceptualize all of these other parts of my identity too. And so it's not a surprise that so many members of the church who choose to disaffiliate feel like they're launched into this identity crisis or this identity loss when they're trying to redefine what it means for them. And so although hybrid identity theory fits really well for that finding, I also think it's important to point out the places where maybe it doesn't fit quite so well. And so as you might remember from the beginning, hybrid identity theory believes that if you form this identity, it's going to be more secure and more stable. And I think that in this case, that might just be a little too simplistic. And so your worldview continues to be in flux post-disaffiliation as identity renegotiation continues. And so it might not feel stable and secure all the time. There might be times where you're also feeling sadness and loss and mourning. Additionally, it might not just be so easy to say, oh, I'll form a hybrid identity, right? That there oftentimes from the participants in this project, they felt a lot of shame around identity exploration because it was kind of their first attempt at pushing back against that mold. And so they felt very nervous and in some cases ashamed about doing that. And so what does this mean and why is this important? What are the implications of this data? And I just want to give out the disclaimer really quick before I go into this, that the information in this presentation is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for treatment or consultation with a mental health practitioner or therapist. But some of the things that I thought about when I was kind of putting this together in terms of clinical implications is that it's important to remember that disaffiliation is not merely a question of where you spend time on Sunday. It is a painful and potentially long-lasting process, and so it's okay if there are a lot of different emotions that come up over time. And so there's a lot of power in being able to hold multiple emotions at the same time. In the data you saw that lots of participants talked about this idea of holding grief and joy at the same time. And so having a both and mentality and allowing yourself to process the emotions, whatever they are that come up, even if they're surprising to you. It also might be important or helpful to reframe the desire to discard the identity of woman. If you feel confident and happy with your identity as a woman and it's something that is part of your identity, it might be helpful to reframe instead the desire to discard or separate yourself from the blueprint of a Mormon woman and all that that entails. And then to allow yourself the space to create your own idea of what it means to be a woman and what you want your life to look like. And then lastly, and this is from another therapist, I can't take credit for this, but a therapist named Natalie Feinblatt, who works mostly with people who have left cults or intense religious structures. And she talks about this idea of reframing and reclaiming your beliefs. And so what was it about that organization that did work for you? Was there any practices that were important or helpful? And how can I reframe them and then reclaim them as the person that I am today with the beliefs and worldviews that I have now? And so lastly, and I'll just breeze through these really fast because of the time, but just some limitations and future directions. Limitations are, there was a lack of racial diversity. The majority of my participants were white. Additionally, the majority of my participants were raised in the United States. And so thinking about different societal and cultural messages, we could get very different results if we had a more diverse sample or a sample from other countries. Additionally, it might be helpful to have a concrete definition of disaffiliation for future studies. And I just think it's important to note that this study takes on an extremely binary view of gender. And I do think, and I'm interested in doing this, I think it would be important in the future to have studies, a similar study for people who are transgender, gender expansive, gender diverse, creative, non-binary. I think that it would be really important to look at their experiences as well, because I think that it would be different than what women experienced in the church. And then future directions, I would love to look at the process of sexualization within the church, so more specifically the impact of modesty, chastity, and purity culture on men and women, as well as how women's perceived responsibility for the thoughts, emotions, and actions of men impacts both men and women. Additionally, how church teachings on womanhood impact women's view of self, such as body positivity, beauty, or self-esteem. And then as a marriage and family therapist, it's clearly important to look at the impact of disaffiliation on family relationships, so mixed faith families, mixed faith marriages, families who disaffiliated together or at different times, grief and loss in relationships, and then just having a better understanding of the stages and process of disaffiliation and what that looks like and how therapists can better help their clients who are going through it. So now I would love to open it up for any questions or comments that you have, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for a few of those.
Okay, so now that we're starting the Q&A, if anybody has any questions, just enter them into the Whova app, and we'll get through as many as we can in our remaining time. Let's see here. First question is there a reason to stay affiliated for your mental health when the rest of your family is active, or is that too much cognitive dissonance?
Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, that's going to be a really hard answer. I'm not sure I can give like a very clear-cut answer for that. I think, as I mentioned, it's just such a kind of a very personal process. And so I think that we have to weigh out a lot of what you're experiencing and also really think about what am I looking for from this change? Is there potentially another way to do it, right? Is there a third way? So unfortunately, that's not a super clear-cut answer, but I think it would take a lot more information and a lot more explanation to get a better answer than that.
Okay, let's see here. Often in the LDS tradition, I was taught being a caretaker of men was not just physical, care for the house, dinner, kids, sex, etc., but also to police their porn use or spirituality, because women are more spiritual. Did this pedestalizing come up at all in the research?
It did, yeah. So mostly in that first theme that we talked about, so kind of the feeling limited by church teachings, that is where a lot of the pedestalization or benevolent misogyny came into it, where participants talked about that very process, where they felt that benevolent misogyny limited them even more because all of these things are your responsibility and also being a caretaker of men. And so that did definitely come up in the responses from participants.
Next question is, do you feel that feminism is just another blueprint women can feel pressure to conform to, or do you feel it frees women to form their own blueprints?
That's a good question. I think for a brief answer, I think any belief system or belief structure, if we hold on to it too tightly or too intensely, or don't allow ourselves flexibility in those belief structures, can become a blueprint. And so I think we have to be careful and kind of take a look at what we feel about kind of the messages that we're taking in. I also think that it could potentially be different. One thing that's coming to mind, and I don't know how well this will come out of my mouth, but oftentimes in the church, it felt like that blueprint was being given to them and that they didn't have an opportunity to say no. And so it might feel different if you're choosing a blueprint for yourself versus being handed one and feeling stuck or trapped into following it. And so I think, yeah, those are kind of probably my two answers, but I think that probably any belief structure or system can become a blueprint if we hold on to it too tightly.
And we have time for one last question. This one is, how can we support women that are in the church but want to be free?
Can you repeat that last little part? You cut out a little bit.
Sorry. How can we support women that are in the church but want to be free?
But want to be free?
Yes.
Oh, that's a good question. I think similar to the clinical implications that I outlined for people who have chosen to disaffiliate, I think being that person who listens and can help to support or ask questions or hold some of that experience and validate some of that experience, I think can be helpful. Just being that person who can help and can hold space for that experience, because I mean, that's a really hard experience to be going through, to have this belief structure, but to want to be free and not quite know how to do that. And so being that person to validate, to support, and to be there with them is probably a very helpful thing that we can do.
All right, well, our time is up. I'd like to thank you all for attending and supporting Sunstone. If anybody would like to continue the discussion, they can continue it in the community chat boards. Otherwise, this will be the end of our session.